Now, the way things are right now, everything is great, meaning that we're able to leverage this Volley library to our advantage. We are able to do HTTP requests and get stuff, and all is great. Now, the problem with this approach that we did here, in fact, we did this on purpose because I just want to show you, and this will work fine, right? This meaning how we are creating our request queue and so forth, right? Now, this is not the best way because each time that we want to invoke our request queue, we have to come down here and say requested add, and in most cases we're going to be actually recreating or creating new objects for request queue every time that we want to go and fetch data online. So this is not good because we don't want to have a class that doesn't really need to be constantly created. In this case it's fine because it's just one example, right? So we want to compartmentalize everything to where we create a class that will take care of instantiating only once. So as we have this application, this project may have different classes or different activities that will have to use this request, this Volley request, right? And notice in this case, if we had all these different activities that require to fetch data from an API, we would have to come every time and create this request queue, invoke the Volley, and do all sort of things. So you can see that's not really good because we're instantiating too many classes of one type, which is not necessarily, right? So there's this concept called of singleton in Java. And that is what we are going to learn a little bit about before I show you the code that will allow us to create a singleton for our Volley here. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the singleton pattern. Now to understand this, let's go back to the basics of creating objects in Java. So when we want to create objects in Java, what do? We use the new keyword. So in this case, if we wanted to create a cheeseburger object, we would say cheeseburger is equal to new cheeseburger. So what are we doing here? Of course, we are using the new keyword, which allows us to call the public. That's very important to remember. This is a public constructor of our cheeseburger class. So that way we can actually construct our object. In this case, a cheeseburger. So if we wanted to create more than one cheeseburger, different objects, of course, we can use the same process. New cheeseburger 1, cheeseburger 3, 2, and so many more. Now, there's nothing really wrong with this process. In fact, this is the basics of object-oriented programming, creating objects and so forth. But one of the problems that we may end up having is that we may create too many objects, too many entry points that are not necessary. Now, there are times when we need the creation of all those objects, obviously, but there are times that we don't. There are times we only need one instance of a particular object. And the solution for that is singleton. A singleton, by definition from the Gang of 4 book, ensures a class has only one instance and provide a global point of access to it. So as opposed to having different instances of a certain class, a certain object, we now, when we use singleton, we are saying we just want to get one instance of that particular class. Now you may ask, what would be an example where we would need just a single class? Well, in situations when you know that a certain class doesn't need to be instantiated every time that it needs to be called. For instance, if you are creating a system where you're putting together a log system, right? A class that would allow developers or the system itself to log out certain messages in the console, then you wouldn't need to have a constant creation of that log object, that log class, because that is just a waste, right? You just want to make sure you have a singleton, one instance of that class. For instance, another example would be if you're creating a settings class for an application, you don't need to have objects of the same type of preferences, right? Because the whole class or the whole system or the whole application would be okay with only one instance. In fact, it is important that it only has one settings class or instance as the application runs. That way there are no currencies issue. Okay, there's a lot of different examples, but the idea here is whenever you want to make sure that there's only one instance of that particular class, then you use a singleton. And of course, as the definition tells us here, it also provides a global point of access. Now let's go ahead and put all of this into perspective so we can actually see the benefits and how to create a singleton. Now that we have an idea what a singleton does and why is it so important, let's come back here and look at the documentation for what we have for Volley. In fact, they give us all the code, them being developed at Android engineers. So they actually want us to do that. So what I'm going to do, in fact, is I'm going to copy this code and explain it as we go. So let's copy this and go to our project. I'm going to go inside of our app, of course, and create a new class here. All right, so new Java class, call this my Singleton. Of course, we're going to find a better name, but that's fine. Say okay. I'm going to just delete all of this and paste all the code that we had. Now we're going to have to import a few things here. So to do that, you just say Option, enter, and all the things are going to be added. And of course, for Windows is Alt, enter, but there we go. Let's say okay. Let's continue. Let's see what else needs help here. Well, our Volley here as well, do the same thing. So we're importing all of these libraries that need imports that are needed for this to actually work. So my Singleton is public, should be declared in a file my singleton.java. I made a mistake. So let's go ahead and see if we can refactor this. Singleton as that, refactor, and there we go. So now it's all good. There we go. So now we have our class here, my Singleton, and you know what a Singleton does right now. Very good. So the idea here, again, is the same thing. What are we doing here? We're creating a static instance of our Singleton there, so that way we can invoke it to actually instantiate it once. That way, anytime we want to create my Singleton, in this case, it's just for our request HTTPs here with Volley, we just have one copy in memory. All right, very good. So there's a few things here that we're not going to be using right away, but I just added here just for completion, really. We have this image loader here. So this image loader here, what are we doing? We're actually instantiating an image loader class that allows us to get the bits, or allows us to download images and create a cache and so forth in the background. So we don't have to worry too much about all this right now, but just think of it as a class instantiated inside of our Singleton, right? That will allow us to get an image from an API and then create a bitmap out of it so that we can actually cache it, so that our application doesn't constantly have to go and fetch the same image if it doesn't need to do so. Okay. Now we have this my Singleton here. So this is the get instance method. So the get instance method allows us to just get an instance of our my Singleton, as opposed to creating new classes every time that we want to use our Singleton here, which in this case just could either get an image or just go and fetch data using Volley, in this case using a request. Okay, very good. So here is very simple. It's saying, okay, if there's an instance already in memory, we're just going to go ahead and create a new one, because there's nothing, right, that we can grab and use. So then we're going to be able to go and create a new one. Otherwise, just return the instance that exists. This is where the magic is, really, okay? And of course, we have this method type request queue. We've seen this before. Now, this one is the request queue that allows us to go and get a request. If there's no request around, so if request is null, we're going to go and create a new request. You notice that it says volley.request, and we pass the get application context. That looks exactly what we did here. We created our request, and then inside of our own create, we said volley.new request queue, and we passed the context, right? So this is what's been done in our Singleton now here, but in a better way. Again, it always checks, okay, is there another request already that we instantiated? If there is one, then just return the one that is current there. Now, the beauty here is that we can use this class anywhere in our project, and we'll always make sure that we're using just this one request or just this one Singleton, which minimizes the instantiation of object, which is not good for memory. Okay, and we have the method, the add request to queue, which we have used this one here, request.add. So now we are putting all in this class Singleton, so that every time we want to use it, we're going to come here and get this one. Okay, the image loader as well and all that stuff. So there we go. So the most important thing here that we really care about is this add to request, and also this get request queue, because that's what we're going to be using. But also the Singleton itself will just be able to get just one instance of this object here, as opposed to every time having to create a new instance of this object, which is just a waste of time and not very efficient. Okay, very good. So now how do we use this? Well, simply let's go back to our main activity here. As opposed to doing like this, I'm going to get rid of all of that, which means I don't need that anymore. which means I don't need that either. Just gonna comment that out so you still have that option there. But now I can just come here and say request queue, call just the queue as such. And inside here, I can come and say queue is equal to what? My singleton, look at that, dot get instance. I'm going to have to pass the context. So for the context here, I could just go and say this dot get application context. Okay. And then I'm going to say dot get request queue. Now this context here, I could have done something like this. I could have just said main activity dot this, that would work. So it's same thing. I could have just said this, that also works. Okay, but sometimes it's good idea to be verbose in Android. This that get application context will allow us to get the entire application context. So this is fine as well. So in this case here, we're just saying my singleton get instance, meaning I just want one instance. So I'm calling this one instance here, which is going to go ahead and say if instance is null, we then are going to create my new singleton. Otherwise, we're going to just return the instance that we already have running. Okay, very good. Now that I have a queue here, I can just use it instead of what we had before. Let's say queue dot add. Look at that. I'm going to add the JSON array request. Save this and run. We should see the same results. However, the beauty here is that we will know that we did things the right way. And you can see, there we go. Right? We're getting the JSON request here, which we are appending the ID, title, and completed. Actually, just the ID and title. Okay, so it's working fine. Nothing really has changed per se, but we know that we did things the right way because now we can just get one request queue as we created here by using my singleton get just one instance and go from there. Okay, so this is the best way of doing this. Every time you want to create a HTTP request, it's important that you put everything inside of a singleton as you see here, and it's much easier and better code. And that's one of the best practices when it comes to coding. All right. Very good. So what I want you to do is to play around this concept, go back and find other APIs, and I want you to use this my singleton. Of course, my singleton, this is not the best name you can give. In fact, you should change that to something more meaningful. That could be, for instance, Volley singleton or something like that. Okay, but at least you get the idea here. Very good. I'll see you next.